Good morning and welcome to our sustainability webinar for December 2023. So this is our last webinar for 2023 and it's the last of a series of 6 webinars where we've looked at the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And in this one, we are exploring decarbonisation strategies. Now, as you know, the first 5 webinars looking at the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, I was joined by Dylan Byrne. Unfortunately, Dylan has been called into urgent client meetings and he cannot make it today. However, as we've said all along, today we'll be joined by Brett Spicer, who is a sustainability partner based in our Brisbane office and actually a decarbonisation expert. So, Brett, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, Aletta.
We would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay our respects to elders past and present. And in Melbourne, I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And we extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. If I can just move my camera. All right. So it's the last sustainability webinar for 2023, but we've already scheduled our webinars for 2024. Therefore, if you want to register for those webinars, you can now do that. You can click on that register here button. It will take you to our website, and the 12 webinars for 2024 have already been set up. So we will start by looking at Australian developments, the ED issued by the Australian Accounting Standards Board, and what we expect to happen in 2024. And then we cover a broad range of topics across activating sustainability at your organization, developing a roadmap. We look at carbon accounting. We look at setting targets and another visit to decarbonisation strategy. We look at voluntary and mandatory reporting, assessing risk and opportunities, scenario analysis around climate-related issues and assessing climate resilience, etc. So you can see we try and cover a broad range of topics across the 12 months. As always, if there's a real big development, we'll work that into our webinars as well. So please register for these webinars. I would also like to promote our IFRS and corporate reporting webinars. So in this webinar series, it's been running for 7 years. It's in its 8th year next year. We look at a number of topics, including sustainability reporting at times. So we start with our normal session in January, what's hot and what's not in 2024, and sustainability reporting is hot. And we'll look at a number of aspects during the year. So if you're interested in IFRS and corporate reporting, you can register for those as well. So back to today's agenda. So we've broken the session into 6 parts. We'll start with a greenhouse gas accounting and developing some low carbon transition roadmaps while we're doing it. Then we move over to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and a bit of an introduction to setting greenhouse gas targets, the steps in setting a greenhouse gas target as outlined by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. We'll briefly touch on science-based targets, SBTI, then we look at decarbonisation and end it off with a brief mention / discussion of a CSIRO report. Quite an impressive report on rapid decarbonisation pathways for Australia, and they've done some modelling. So I really just want to flag it with you so you can go and look at the great work they've done. So that's the 6 sections for today. And the way we'll deal with it today is I'll be covering the content on the slides, and Brett, as the practical expert, will add some comments throughout. So Brett, I'll give you an opportunity to interrupt, or please just interrupt as we go along. And thank you for bringing that expertise to the webinar. In the very first section where we look at greenhouse gas accounting, and developing these low carbon transition roadmaps, we're just setting back and trying to set the scene on what are the business implications of the Paris Agreement. Now, we know the Paris Agreement was a landmark international deal that was signed by 195 countries, incorporating pledges dealing with greenhouse gas emissions, mitigation, adaptation, and finance. And it started in the year 2020. And these international agreements creates a patchwork of regulations across various jurisdictions and countries that also then create opportunities and implications. So business plays a really important role in supporting these activities at international and national levels. So if you look at a kind of a bit of an overview around the Paris Agreement and why it's important to your business, you know, the first part was setting that long-term goal to limit global warming to well below the 2 degrees. Then there were national pledges to cut greenhouse gas emissions. And Australia was a bit slow out of the blocks, but we've got to national pledges. Then there's the pledge for deeper emission cuts and improvements through lower carbon technologies. We need low carbon technologies, we need innovation. So that's an important part. The fourth thing really is that we start to realize cost savings and we start to reduce energy consumption. So it's not just moving to renewable energy, but actually trying to reduce energy consumption. And then the last one, and that's what we're definitely starting to see, and that's shifts in investments away from high carbon assets. In Australia, a way that we really see it is through super funds, directing funds to low carbon assets, and a need to move to low carbon assets. Some of our clients have to report to investors, including super funds, on a quarterly basis on what their carbon footprint is, what their targets is, and how they progress towards that. So you can see that, you know, having made a Paris Agreement, having countries and governments make certain pledges not good enough. We need businesses to play their role. So that's really a bit of an introduction to what we're looking at today, how business can set targets and how businesses can assist with decarbonisation at a holistic level. If you want to look at, so, you know, as a business, why would we measure our footprint? Why would we set targets? Why would we get involved, really? And we still get this question. Brett, I don't know about you, but I still get this question, you know, why would we do it? And at a high level, it is to help manage your greenhouse gas risks. So it's a risk management aspect. There's also an aspect around competitive advantage. So it encourages organizations and people within organizations to identify opportunities so that the business can benefit from this forward thinking on climate change. And lastly, and definitely not least of all, is this strengthening of investor confidence and credibility. So we can say to investors, not only have we measured our carbon footprint, we've set targets, we're working towards it, and there's a bit of confidence and credibility. I know you would, yes, Brett.
I was just going to add, Aletta, I think there's also some incidental benefits that can't be overlooked, and that's around the potential for cost savings. So I've worked with a couple of companies, and one in particular I'm thinking of, it was a small manufacturer that used a lot of compressed air in its processes. And so in the process of setting their greenhouse gas baselines and doing the investigation around where they consumed energy within the business, they were able to identify some leaking compressed air assets within the business, maintain those. Not only was it then turning off the compressors that were running overnight when no one was around, and therefore saving on their greenhouse gas footprint, but it was also a practical cost saving because they weren't consuming electricity overnight when no one was around. So there's a potential incidental benefit there of sort of cost savings if the baseline or the accounting is done at a sort of sufficiently granular level, I suppose.
Oh, and Brett, that's a fantastic comment, because I think there's a misconception with many entities that measuring carbon footprint and decarbonizing will add costs. Yes, there's additional effort, manpower required, but as you've just explained, and we've also seen it with clients, that there can be a reduction in cost, there can be efficiencies, there can be improvement. It can actually be good for your profit and loss. If you want to focus on profit and the bottom line, it can be good for that. If you have a closer look at some of these processes potentially, that maybe we haven't looked at it through this lens. So absolutely agree. Thank you for sharing. And then also potentially a little bit of a high-level framework on what we're seeing in, how people tackle this whole greenhouse gas accounting and developing these low carbon transition plans. So usually, and as you know, over the last 4 or 5 months, we've talked about it, you have to start with setting organizational and operational boundaries for your greenhouse gas risk exposure, reduction opportunities, and measurement. I think often people rush to the second thing, and that's accounting and measuring scope 1, 2, and 3, and they rush past the boundaries. Very important to do that. Then we actually get to accounting and the validation of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Then we go to, let's look at facilitating pathways to greenhouse gas reduction. So what's the strategy? What's the planning we can do? So let's look for those opportunities. If we move on to, as part of those opportunities, let's look at the drivers of greenhouse gas risks and opportunities. So mapping those operational and contextual carbon footprint to the risks and a forward-looking approach. I think what's interesting, there's also that self-regulation and best practices developed within organizations to align to sustainability benchmarking, potentially setting up an internal carbon pricing. And Brett, you would know that one of our BDO firms globally have actually set up an internal carbon pricing for their business. And this was around actually business travel. And there's a carbon price associated with that goes to the P&L of different business units, different partners. Now partners are thinking twice about this because it gets allocated to their little business unit or their P&L. So it's just an example of how that internal carbon pricing can help. It's a self-regulation, it's an internal thing, you don't report it, but just kind of forcing people to think about carbon, not just dollars, but also think about carbon. And then validate your business strategy. So that resilience in your business growth. So how are we going to grow our business, but also manage decarbonization at the same time? Again, that alignment of the strategy with business units. And finally, when we look at these targets, how do we manage it? How do we disclose it? How do we report it? So it starts with the boundaries and it ends up with reporting. And I think what's interesting throughout this whole process is linking it to business units, linking it to changing behavior and changing decision making.
And Aletta, I think it's important as going through this process, and particularly around that transition or the roadmap and identifying some of the greenhouse gas reduction strategies. It's important to understand the business case for each of those things, and I think you touch on this a bit more in some of the subsequent slides, but not to lose that there may be things that will have a significant impact on your overall emissions footprint, but your ability to contribute to or influence those things may be diminished. So is that where you necessarily focus your effort if you don't have a great ability to contribute? And an example of that is where we've worked with some mining clients where clearly the big trucks that drive around the mine site is one of their most significant emissions footprint. But until the OEMs that produce the fleets of trucks move their fleet along, that's probably not where they focus their effort near term. They need to think about it longer term, but in the business case, really understanding what contribution you can make to those reduction strategies and where you're going to get your bang for your buck.
Yeah, and Brett, interesting you talk about those vehicles. In that CSIRO report, they talk about, you know, they were modeling and looking at what it could look like in future, and they were saying it's fairly easy to electrify light vehicles. But it's harder with bigger vehicles, and you have to start to potentially look at new innovation and hydrogen, etc. And imagine aircrafts and the big ships will come through our ports. So it becomes harder and harder. So they've got some ideas in that report. I have to tell you, interesting report. If we look at a bit of an introduction to setting a greenhouse gas target, I just want to link it back to what we've talked about over the previous 5 months. Now, what you can see here is an extract of the carbon footprint of BDO Australia. It's been published in our 2023 sustainability report. And it just gives you, you know, we've been talking about this for 5 months, measuring your carbon footprint, and you get to your carbon footprint, which looks something like this. And you could say this is our carbon footprint, or this is our greenhouse gas inventory, the kind of terminology we use. And what you can see here, we've broken it down within our different scopes, and we've got the total emissions for each scope that was relevant. And we have it for 2 years, we have percentage movement, and we've also in each and every year looked at what percentage of our total footprint is assigned to a particular category. So you can see 97% roughly of our carbon footprint sits in scope 3. But what we've also got at the bottom is a bit of an emissions intensity that I want to flag, because we'll come back to that. So we've got emissions per average full-time equivalent, we've got emissions per million Aussie dollars, etc. So you've got this inventory, or you've got your carbon footprint, you've worked really hard to get to this stage. And then the question really is, you know, this inventory is done, what next? And usually setting a target is that logical follow-up step, because otherwise we'll just be reporting our footprint year on year on year. Nice to report, good to report, but surely the aim of the game is how can we set a target and work towards a target. So that's why today we're doing the final in this series and saying, now that we've measured your greenhouse gas inventory, what about targets? Let's think about targets. Now, some of the reasons people would set a target, other than it's a logical step, I think really important. We want to make sure that we keep carbon accounting and decarbonisation on senior management, and I would say boards as well, or governance radar. So it's not we've done it, tick the box. You know, what next? So keep it on their radar. They might think they've done it and they can now park it. Also, we want to, in the second bullet point, ensure that carbon continues to be factored into all relevant decisions, strategic decisions within an organization. So what products and services to provide, what materials and technologies to use, potential innovation. So we want to change decision making. We want to embed it into strategic risk management, operational decision making. So obviously we want to minimize and manage our greenhouse gas risks. As Brett alerted to, we want to achieve cost savings. Wouldn't that be amazing? Achieve cost savings, and it often can happen. We want to stimulate innovation. We need innovation for those big trucks on the mining sides, so we can decarbonize and save costs. We want to prepare for future regulations. So we know more and more these regulations are coming globally in Australia. A lot of businesses, it's important to demonstrate leadership, corporate responsibility. Remember, we often talk about access to capital, access to markets, access to people, and demonstrate leadership, show to the bank, show stakeholders that we're taking this seriously, and then also participating in voluntary programs. A lot of these things might be seen as voluntary in Australia at the moment, but from a global landscape, it's actually mandatory in order to continue to do business. So, you know, I use voluntary carefully here. Not much here is voluntary. The market is driving this. customers is driving globally, it's moving. So that's why we would set a target. If we move on in the steps in setting a greenhouse gas target, as you know, when we looked at measuring our greenhouse gas emissions or our carbon footprint, we've looked at our greenhouse gas protocol publications. And again, today, when we look at decarbonisation, we go back and look at what the greenhouse gas protocol says about decarbonisation. So if you look at the steps, we've got the 10 steps that they've outlined. You know, obtain senior management commitment. We've talked about that earlier. Decide on the target type, decide on the target boundary, choose a target base year, define the target completion date, define the length of the target commitment period, decide on the use of offsets or credits, establish a target double counting policy, decide on a target level, and then track and report your progress. So a number of steps to get to the actual target, and then we have to track and we have to report. So if we break it down, and I've got comprehensive notes here, and I don't want to step through them in great detail, but I've left the notes in there for your information. I think when we look at step 1, obtaining senior management commitment, it's important to have senior management buy-in. It also includes buy-in from the board, audit and risk committee. We have a lot of meetings at the moment with audit and risk committees because all of this is going into the annual report. Audit and risk committee is very interested. We want changes in behavior and decision making. We want internal accountability and maybe an incentive scheme. We want to make sure there's adequate resources so senior management can help us with adequate resources. So I think that's really important. Step 1, senior management, governance, board input, buy-in, commitment. That's where you have to start. Absolutely.
Sorry, yes. Aletta, I'll just pick up on those points you're making. I think it's fundamentally this is a change management exercise in many instances, you know, where I've seen it within organisations, and you're absolutely right. The ones that fail is where there's not that buy-in at senior management level, at board level, and right through the organisation, because fundamentally, you know, there will be setting targets and actioning or setting up initiatives against those targets. There is fundamentally a change management exercise there. So I don't think, you know, could emphasise this one enough about getting the board on board essentially and getting management on board.
Absolutely, and Brett, you know our own business, BDO Australia, we started by speaking to our CEO, Tony Schiffman, then we spoke to all the managing partners, and then we went to the board and said, this is what we want to do, we believe BDO Australia should do, and only once the board and the CEO and the managing partners said they're on board did we go ahead. And so we actually did this in our own organisation. I think really important. If we go to the next step, so decide on the target type, there are 2 broad types of greenhouse gas targets. You can set an absolute target or an intensity-based target. And an absolute target is usually expressed in terms of a reduction over time in a specified quantity. Brett, can I ask, can you hear my snorty dog in the background?
You can. It sounds like you got the posties just arrived or something.
I reckon that's what happened. Just give me a second so I can shut her up for a second.
That's all right. I think I might, while Aletta's on it, you've got your dog coming in, joining the webinar, Aletta.
She's joining the webinar. I think it's 2 things. The post to arrive at the most inconvenient times, as you know, when I'm doing a webinar. And also, this dog is a COVID dog. She's extremely jealous, Brett. So when I'm speaking to people on the laptop, she's figured out that's what I'm doing. She's not getting my attention. That's really what it is. Anyway, let's see if she's calm now. I apologize for that. An absolute target is usually expressed in terms of reduction over time in a specified quantity of greenhouse gas emissions, and specifically around tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. So absolute targets, the totals, or the intensity target, and I've shown you the intensity factors for Australia, and maybe we want to look at reducing the intensity target. So it's a reduction relative to something else in the business. So for BDO Australia, we had our emissions relative to full-time staff, because we've got a lot of staff and our people is our biggest asset. So what are our emissions per full-time equivalent? And we had emissions relative to revenue. And often this intensity helps with businesses which is going through a growth phase, which BDO Australia is doing. So as you grow, if you look at an absolute target, it might be difficult. But as you grow people, as you grow revenue, if we focus on intensity, it gives us some abilities to still track and achieve relative reduction, let's put it that way. If entities use that intensity target, it's a recommendation that you disclose both your absolute and intensity target. We don't want people to hide behind intensity targets, let's put it that way. So if you look at absolute targets, some advantages. So it's designed to achieve a reduction in that specified quantity. It's environmentally robust. It looks at transparency, and it addresses some stakeholder concerns, on how we manage absolute targets. There are some disadvantages around it. So it's difficult. I think the last one maybe it's, or the second last one, it recognizes a company for reducing greenhouse gases by decreasing production or output. So there's organic decline, where most businesses want to grow the business. So that could be seen as a disadvantage. So we don't want to, reduce the size of our business just in order to reduce our carbon footprint. We want to grow our business. And also it may be difficult to achieve if we grow unexpectedly, and if that growth is linked to greenhouse gas emissions. So we've set all these targets, but there's an unexpected growth, and we don't want carbon setting also to have an impact on potential acquisitions, mergers, etc. The one thing that I should say is when we have structural changes, we might have to recalculate in order to get comparable information. So we've had that in our business as well. You could potentially look at certain offices within BDO Australia, but as we grow and integrate more and more offices, we have to make sure that we've got comparable information for all the offices that integrate over the journey. So absolute targets have some advantages, some disadvantages. Intensity targets, again, it might increase comparability amongst different companies. So we focus on the intensity of each business independent of its size potentially. Again, a number of disadvantages as well. Companies with diverse operations may find it difficult to have a single common business metric to align to. So you can see in ours, we've aligned to full-time staff or full-time equivalent, and we've aligned to revenue, which is two key measures for us. But to find that one which is best representative of your business might be very difficult. And then also, there might be, if you use a monetary variable like revenue, there is some complexity around inflation impacts of revenue. So how do we track it, and how do we have comparable information in that situation? So there's no one right answer here. It is what's best for your business, and in the end, useful comparable information to your users. I think that's the answer. Then if we look at the target boundary, now when we initially measured our carbon footprint, we looked at the boundary, operational boundaries. We've looked at organizational and operational boundaries. And again, we'll try and align this to what we've done for our measurement, because if we measure and the target is not aligned, how are we going to measure progress over time? So I think that's important. So some of the things to think about is which greenhouse gases are we looking at? And there my dog goes again. Which greenhouse gases are we looking at? Which geographical operations? Which direct and indirect emission sources are we focusing on? So some entities initially just measure scope 1 and 2, and then they just set a target for scope 1 and 2. And then over time, they also measure scope 3, maybe initially just upstream and then downstream. So based on what you're measuring, you can set targets in order to get activity and decisions. And you can set separate targets for different types of businesses and even maybe different business units in your broader group. So that's just a, decide on that target boundary. Step 4, choose the target base year. It's important to decide whether we have a fixed target base year or whether we've got a rolling target base year. To give you a bit of an example what the difference is, a fixed target base year, we might say we will emit a certain percentage less in year B compared to year A. So we're going to emit 50% less in 2030 compared to 2020. All right, so there's a fixed reference year that sits in the past. If you look at a rolling target base year, we might say over the next 5 years, we'll reduce emissions every year by 5% compared to the previous year. So your base is just the previous year. So again, some implications on whether you want to have a fixed point 2020, for example, or whether you just want to look at the previous year. Often there's a base year, you do your initial carbon footprint on a base year, and usually we've got a target, a fixed target base year, or that's what we're seeing really, and that's what the market seems to demand. Brett, I don't know whether you see a rolling target base year much?
Generally see the fixed.
Yeah.
I think something, yeah, I think more often it's the fixed year. But to your point before, it's about setting what's the representative base year. There was a number of businesses we'd worked with that were starting to think of 2020 or 21 as their base year, and it's, well, operations were a little bit skewed in that period during COVID, so it wasn't reasonable to use that as the base year. So.
Yeah, and we did exactly that. Brett, initially BDO Global was thinking of a base year of 2021. We did all the calculations and we also did 2022 and then decided on 22 is more representative as a good base. Yes, so absolutely. Step 5, so then define the target completion date. Now, I don't think we'll ever get to a completion date because this is continuous improvement over a long period of time. But when you set a target, we need some kind of end date to this target. And I think then we will revisit targets over time. And it could be a fairly short end date or a longer term end date. Now, if it's a short term, just a couple of years or 5 years up to 2030, there's that end date. Usually shorter term, we can more reliably estimate whether we can get there, how we get there, and you will look at innovation and you look at technology that's currently available and that can help you over the short term. The longer term, example of short term in Australia is a lot of Australian businesses are looking at a short term target of 2030. And then longer term, as we know, government would like us to get to a net zero by 2050. A lot of businesses have aligned to that, but there's a lot of uncertainty how we're going to get there. And therefore, there's that uncertainty range towards the end. And that's maybe a fairly an estimation, a lot of uncertainty, maybe more an ambitious target date. So I'm seeing a lot of businesses running with a short-term target and a long-term target, hoping that the short-term target will take them to the long-term target. Short-term existing technology, long-term working really hard on innovation to get some assistance to reach those longer-term targets.
I think that would agree that interim target, or that short-term target as part of a longer-term journey, is an important one. And again, we see that with a lot of businesses that we've worked with. The interim target, there's through capital allocation cycles and asset planning cycles, there's usually a degree of certainty 5 years out with many businesses. And so what we often see is that those targets are set around absolute emissions because there's an understanding of the things that can be controlled. The longer term is often then a combination of absolute reduction target as well as the emissions intensity, given all the uncertainty about production, about assets, about equipment that'll be available in the market. It's often that combination, whereas the near-term target often is sort of more focused on the absolute.
Absolutely. And Brett, I think when we start to look at a short-term and a long-term target, it kind of flags to businesses the need to innovate and the need to invest in research and development in order to achieve it, right? And I think that's the interesting interaction as well. And I must say, every year when I look at the budget, federal budget, I look for is government investing in innovation to help with this process, because I think that's what's needed, an encouragement for businesses to innovate. And so I think it should be in the budget, federal budget. Step 6 is define the length of that target commitment period. So the period of time during which emissions is actually measured against the target. It ends at that target completion date, which might be 2030 or might be 2050. So, many companies use a single year commitment period. The Kyoto Protocol specifies a multi-year first commitment period of 5 years, 2008 to 2012. So again, to decide what that length of the period is, I must say I'm seeing the annual one most often in our clients. Then step 7, and Brett, I know you've got a bit of a passion for this, and that is the decide on the use of offsets or credits. So, often businesses look at their carbon footprint, they look at setting a target, and then they say, we think we've got a problem here. We cannot entirely meet internal these targets by internal reductions. We might need to buy some offsets or buy some credits. So when would these offsets and credits be appropriate? So we know this is not the first place to go to, that businesses should try and reduce emissions. But if you have to go there, when would it be appropriate? So maybe cost of internal reductions is really high. Maybe opportunities or technology available for the reductions would be limited. Or maybe you don't meet your target due to unexpected circumstances. And I was actually thinking here, Brett, a little bit around the safeguard mechanism. If you can't meet those targets, you're forced to buy offsets in Australia.
Definitely that mechanism through the safeguard arrangements for those offsets. I think it's worth noting, and you definitely made the point that offsets shouldn't be the first thing you go to, and some of the frameworks, such as Science-Based Target Initiative, largely discount the use of offsets in achieving targets. But there's a pragmatism that says, as you say, for those reasons where offsets may be appropriate, then entering the market to procure offsets. I think you talk a bit more about the integrity of offsets in subsequent slides, and that's a very important one.
Absolutely. And what's interesting, when I look at IFRS S2, the mandatory reporting, they're actually talking about disclosing a lot of this information because, there's a little bit of a skepticism around offsets and credits, and therefore you have to disclose if you are planning to use offsets or credits, how and where do you get them, how much you'll be using. So again, the reporting, closing the loop there as well. Then, as you've said, the credibility of offsets and transparency. I think there's a lot of questions at the moment, are all of these credits created equal? Can I just buy anyone? And I think the answer is no, you have to do some due diligence and some homework. And you know, if your assurance providers are going to ask some questions as well. So you do need information around the type of project, the geographical and organizational origin of the offsets, how they've been quantified, and whether they've been recognized by external programs. And I think that's incredibly important. If you don't want to invest too much time and energy in this, the fact that they've at least accredited by external programs will give you some comfort as well. So I think that's important.
It's an interesting note there, Aletta, some of the work that people within BDO do around the assurance side. So market participants, either the creator of the offset or potential buyer of offset, have come to BDO and asked for assurance around the integrity and the validity of those offsets before a transaction occurs.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good plug for, if you're looking for some assistance, please reach out and we can put you in contact with all the right people. Then step 8, that double counting policy. You know, there's a little bit of uncertainty on how this double counting issue should be addressed. But I think it's important that companies develop their own policy. It's a little bit like an accounting policy, your target double counting policy. So really, this policy should specify how reductions and trades relate to other targets and programs, and how it will be reconciled with your corporate target. So are there any double counting issues that you run into? So I'll give you some examples. It could be that you've got double counting of offsets. And so this is when a greenhouse gas offset is counted towards the target by both the selling and the purchasing organization. So there's a little bit of a double counting there. Both entities are looking at it. So really, how do we deal with that? What is our policy? And I think transparency is the key to that particular one. And then also double counting due to a bit of target overlap. So this can occur when sources included in under a company's corporate target are also subject to limits by an external program or another company's target. So yes, there's overlap. Let's be clear about it. Let's be transparent about it. And I think that communication between various organizations is really important. And then step 9, now we decide on that target level. So we've gone through all these criteria. I think this is where it gets really interesting and important. To me, a critical thing is understanding the key drivers that affect your greenhouse gas emissions. So what are those relationships between business metrics and greenhouse gas emissions? So whether it's production, whether it's square footage of manufacturing space, whether it's number of employees, whether it's revenue, etc. What are the key drivers of your emissions? That's step 1. Let's look on the reduction opportunities that are currently available to get to these reductions. Also investigate potential changes that will occur, potential new technology. Looking at the future of the company, what is our projections? What are our growth strategies? So we have to look at this all holistically and not just focus on one item. So let's look at growth factors, so production plans, revenue targets, what will drive investment strategy. Consider whether there are any existing environmental or energy plans, capital investments, changes in products or services that's already in place. I think this is an interesting one. Are there plans already in place for fuel switching, on-site power generation, for renewable energy investment? And I know this is a big talking point in Australia at the moment. I think most action we are seeing on decarbonisation, Brett, at the moment is around scope 2, around energy. And a lot of organisations are actually locking into power purchase arrangements to ensure that they've got access to renewable energy going forward, because everybody's going for renewable energy. If you can lock it in now, you know, often a good idea. And then also benchmarking against similar organizations in your industry. And I think that's where industry disclosures comparisons that we have in the SASB is actually quite important, that benchmarking, because certain industries will find this harder than others.
Yeah,
I
think
sure you have comments here.
yeah. Oh, look, I think the only little bit I'd add to what you've said is in the setting of the targets, it's got to be evidence-based. So, thinking about some of the businesses I've worked with that have done it well, and coming back to the comment earlier on that fundamentally this is a bit of a change management exercise. So, setting targets, you're potentially shifting direction, in a large or small scale, but you're fundamentally shifting the direction of the business by setting these targets. If it's not evidence-based, if it's sort of intuitive and we think this is what the target should be, you're setting yourself up for failure because you can't support the investment case for allocating capital or making business decisions against the target. So I think I would really emphasise that point. And some of this can be pretty complex trying to set the target, but ensure that you have the evidence base and ensure that any of these decisions about what the target is empirical, so you have a reference point to go back to. Couldn't stress that enough.
Yeah, thank you very much, Brett. And then step 10 is the track and report progress. So tracking, I think what Brett's just said, the evidence base is so critical because now you'll have to track against that target. So if you've set an unrealistic target, not based on evidence, you're going to come short in step 10, right? Because you're going to struggle to meet these targets. So evidence-based, and now we have to track, so carry out regular performance checks on how we're tracking against the targets we've set. And if there's something we've missed, we can update for sure, but it's important to set us up for success. And as you know, from a greenwashing perspective, ASIC is very active. Once you have set targets, they want to make sure there's a plan behind the target to achieve that target. And again, that will have to based, as Brett said, based on evidence on if this is the starting point, if this is the target, how can we realistically get there? What is our plan to get there based on evidence? And ASIC is knocking on doors asking for that information. And then when we look at reporting, the suggested reporting, this is not mandated, but the types of things we could report. IFRS S2 will mandate what we have to report around this as well. But, what are your target boundaries, your target type, the base year, all the things we've talked about, whether we'll use offsets, is there a double counting policy, what is that target level? And then, as we progress, if we're using an intensity target to report that, if we've got trades to report that, report on internal project reductions that we've sold or we've transferred to other organizations to use as an offset. I think that will be quite important within the agricultural space. If we've transferred or sold it to other entities, our credits, and then an overall performance in relation to the target. I think what I'm trying to show here is it's not just this is the targets and this is how we're tracking and it's one measure, one disclosure. There's a lot of information to add color to how you're tracking towards your target. And this is what's suggested by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. All right, so you've mentioned this earlier, Brett, and that is science-based targets. So I thought we look at the Greenhouse Gas Protocol because we've been talking about it over 5-6 months. But I think science-based targets is very important, and I've included here a link to the SBTI Science-Based Target Initiative and the process they encourage and follow. There's a lot of information available. And within BDO Global, we're currently busy with science-based targets as well. So to commit, to develop, to submit. So you actually submit it for their official validation, which I think is really important. Then you communicate and you disclose. So this is the process by SBTI. A little bit of an overview. What is the meaning of science-based? If greenhouse gas emission reduction targets adopted by companies are considered science-based, if they are in line with the latest climate science, and what the latest climate science says is necessary to meet goals of the Paris Agreement to limit global warming to less than the 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial temperatures by 2030. And what's good about science targets, it provides companies with a clearly defined pathway to future-proof growth by specifying how much, how quickly they need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So a little bit of benefits of setting science-based targets. You'll reduce regulatory uncertainty, again, investor confidence and credibility. And Brett, the one that you've talked about earlier, improve profitability and competitiveness. So, you know, if we set ambitious targets now, it would ensure lean, efficient, and durable company for a future growth and reduce our costs. So I think it links back to your earlier comment. This I've taken from the SBTI documents, and it's just a step-by-step guide on stepping through your targets. So you commit, so you complete and submit your commitment letter to them. Then you model your targets, so review the target setting resources, criteria, recommendations, and other guidance. So you model your targets. Then you get that targets validated by SBTI. I've heard that they are quite swamped at the moment, and it takes quite a number of months to hear back from them because this is such a big thing in Europe at the moment. Then you announce your new targets that's been validated by SBTI. You implement your targets and you start to track and disclose. So you can see that SBTI puts a lot of rigor around target setting, which I think is a great thing. Right, Brett, decarbonisation. So we've measured our carbon footprint, we've set targets, maybe we've got a science-based target, maybe it's validated by SBTI. What is this carbon mitigation hierarchy? And I've included some links to articles that we've written over the last few years. I think this one was by Sharif, where we said the starting point is to avoid. You want to reduce emissions by avoid creating them. That's the starting point. That's the best thing to do. If not, let's reduce. So let's make our activities less emissions intensive. So maybe new efficient technologies or upgrading to more modern processes. Then we can also restore. So replace emissions by transitioning to renewable energy sources. So I know a lot of wind energy in Tasmania, or hydropower or solar. And then finally offset. And we said that's the least favored position, but if you have to go there, you go there, where you buy offset. So that's just the hierarchy, and there's an article talking through that a little bit. We've also written another article around the decarbonisation challenge, and again, I've picked up some of that. You know, so you will have to determine the decarbonisation approach that provides the greatest benefit for the cost, so that cost benefit analysis. So it could be replacing fossil fuels for electricity generation with renewable sources. I think we see a big push on that in Australia at the moment. Brett, one that I think would be close to your heart, changing the feedstock in industrial processes into more carbon neutral sources, and then also capturing the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We could also consider less direct forms of decarbonisation. So maybe, you know, reduce emissions from existing processes, increased efficiency, maybe reuse or recycling. You know, I know there's also some of our partners that do a lot of work around waste management and potential recycling, the infrastructure team. Decarbonisation is not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's easier for certain industries than other, but I think the key thing for us is to encourage businesses to start the process to consider what they could do in this space.
I would just add to that too. There's obviously the practical, you know, what are the opportunities to decarbonise? How do we decarbonise our business? But for it to work effectively, this idea of an emissions footprint and reducing it needs to be embedded within all governance suite across, the enterprise governance suite. So there's no point sort of one part of the business setting a target and working towards it, but the procurement function hasn't picked up that, and so they're still buying emissions intensive products, or the capital allocation framework hasn't incorporated this. So I guess there's a practical, what are the things we can do to reduce our emissions, but ensuring everyone's singing from the same hymn sheet across the business when investment decisions are being made is critical.
Absolutely. So this is why we say this is a transformation or business transformation to change the way we all think and how do we get buy-in. And I think Justin Harness, our partner in Sydney, will be very happy when we talk about transformation, which is his great passion. Then also on how do we decarbonize, this is actually an article that I've linked from BDO in the US, where they've written an article around common approaches to data-driven decarbonisation strategies. So I think, Brett, this is a different way of saying we need evidence-based decarbonisation strategies. And how they've articulated it, and I've just put the images here, but you can read the article. They say, you align and define your strategy, absolutely strategy. We build a strong foundation and accurate, reliable data around carbon footprint, for example. Step 3, interesting, identify some quick wins and develop a business case for investing potentially in technology innovation for the other items, and then build a long-term strategy that is aligned with the broader business goals. So it's just an interesting way to think about it. Nice article to have a read of. This is another article we've written, and I liked, there was something that jumped out of this article when I read it last night, is that a common approach, a common approach that where a carbon reduction strategy starts is by identifying the bigger buckets of emissions and looking at the ease with which you can start to reduce these. So if you look at your carbon footprints, which are the biggest buckets? That's one thing. And the other overlapping item is how easy it is to move on these emissions. Hopefully you get a sweet spot where it's really big and easy to move, and that's an obvious place to start. So, and again, another article to look at. Finally, as I said earlier, I've been super impressed by work that's been done with the CSIRO, and I've included a link to their report. Now, they've got a full report, a lengthy report, and then there's all a summary of findings. And this is an image, the summary of the findings, a link to where you can find the full report or the summary. And really what they've done is they've done some modeling. And obviously CSIRO is our Australian National Science Agency, but they've done some modeling on that illustrates how Australia's economy will need to transform to reach net zero by 2050. So some interesting findings in here. It might give you some ideas, some perspective. I've just grabbed a few bits here. It's a great read. So they've said existing technologies can be deployed faster to reduce emissions by 52% from 2020 levels by 2030. So potentially saying there are existing technologies that we should deploy a bit faster or could deploy faster. Again, they talked about renewable energy, and they say there's modeling around renewable energy grows to more than 90% of the power mix by 2030, which is incredibly interesting. It's going to be a competitive market. So, talking about the share of the nation's electricity needs that are met by renewable sources is projected to more than triple between 2020 and 2030. There's a little bit of modeling around solar capacity and also wind capacity. So interesting stuff around renewable energy. They look at different industries as well. And this one is, I've just grabbed the transport one because we've talked about electrification of vehicles and the heavy vehicles on the mining sites. And here they've talked about decarbonisation of transport is vital but complex. And it plays out differently across different models. So whether it's light vehicles, heavy vehicles, aircraft, etc. So this is some modeling. They said in 2020, you know, transport sector is the third largest emission source, making up 19% of Australia's emissions in 2020. And electric vehicles make up 2% of new car sales. So that was 2020. Fast forward some modeling to 2030, electric vehicles make up 23% of passengers vehicles on and light vehicles on the road. So it's a big jump, 2% to 23%. And then also EVs reach some cost parity with new internal combustion vehicles. And then potentially by 2030, EVs make up more than half of new car sales. And I think, you know, we've recently been looking around at vehicles, you know, adult children looking at vehicles. Everywhere you go, electric vehicles, and, you know, my adult children quite inclined to look at electric vehicles. They just think about the petrol saving, to be fair. And then 2040, we look at shipping decarbonisation via hydrogen, and biofuels could potentially begin by 2040 based on the modelling. Air transport has begun to decarbonise via biofuels. Potentially, EVs make up 73% of passenger and light vehicles on the roads. You know, and maybe the sale of new internal combustion engine vehicles ceased by 2035. Right? Remember, this is just about modelling.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
I have to drop off, unfortunately. So, but you've got this from here, I think. So, thank you.
All good. Brett, thank you very much for joining.
Pleasure.
And then by 2050, we talk about some heavy transport, you know, a mix of electronic and heavy vehicle. So I hope I've given you a little bit of a taste of what this report is about. An amazing report, so interesting. So I've given you some of the key aspects that they've covered. So if we look at tools and resources, these are some BDO tools and resources. We've got a sustainability activation checklist to help you to get started on this journey. We've got a TCFD checklist to help you with disclosures in your annual report. We've got some free TCFD e-learning that you could look at. We've got some insights, so you can register for corporate reporting insights, sustainability insights. You can look at our website for information. And then obviously, if you're looking for some assistance, please reach out to us. I would like to end the webinar and the series of webinars for 2023 to thank you for joining us every month. We really appreciate your support. We've scheduled the webinars for 2024. We hope you join us again. And if you need any support, please reach out to Dylan or Brett or me or any of the people in our broader team. And there's an updated list of contacts. You can see Christy Porter has recently joined us as a partner in Perth as well. If you celebrate Christmas, I wish you a Merry Christmas. I also wish all of you some family time and time to relax, and we'll speak in the new year.